So good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay at the back? See up the back there? Yep, all good? Okay, so my name is Matt Roberts. I'm a distinguished engineer for the IBM integration portfolio. So that's the area of IBM that includes our IBM API Connect offering, but also a number of other integration offerings around enterprise messaging and event streaming and various other areas as well. I'm joined today by Jeremy Mason, who's the Chief Digital Architect for Lloyds Banking Group. As far as the goals for this session, first half of the session, I'm going to talk about some of our hybrid cloud API scenarios, where we see that from an IBM perspective going in the industry, and what the different patterns of usage and deployment are. And then I'll hand over to Jeremy, and he's going to talk us through the API journey at Lloyds, how those hybrid API scenarios are being delivered in the context of Tier 1 banking. So without further ado, just to set the scene, there's a lot of focus both on APIs at events like this, but also how do you deliver those APIs? And what we're seeing very strongly is the hybrid model of delivery is something that a lot of both small and large customers are getting into. From an industry perspective, that's being delivered, kind of motivated by a number of different things. We had the great digital shift, so the COVID health pandemic over the last 2-3 years has really driven a wild increase in the amount of digitization that all organizations have been going through. There's a statistic here from McKinsey, something like 10 years worth of digitization have happened in just 1 year in that kind of 2019-2020 timeframe. So at the same time, as consumers, we're becoming more and more familiar and more demanding on the way that we consume data. So we expect to have that ubiquitous and instant-on delivery model and consumption model for different sources of data. Contrast that on the right-hand side with the growing complexity that there is in many organizations. So something like half of all organizations having over 100 applications in their space today. So the question then becomes, well, given all those various data silos, as it were, how do we join them together and provide that great experience, that great embedding that Simon was talking about? How do we provide a consistent view to all of our organizations? So that piece is really kind of becoming a driver for not just kind of single platforms for API management, but also a combination of those different platforms. Clearly, like APIs are one of the key ways of joining together various systems and providing that consistent experience across the world. But there are a number of technical challenges and difficulties that kind of need to be overcome when driving that, which we'll talk about here. So I'm going to discuss probably 5 or so different patterns of hybrid cloud API management. You can probably see as you kind of think about where your own organization fits in relation to some of these. I'm not suggesting this is a kind of left to right, everyone does all of them, but you'll probably find yourself in one or more of these different scenarios. So one of the kind of typical starting points for enterprises is like a single API deployment. Like I have a platform, I have some APIs I want to expose to my customers. How do I deliver that to them? Very simple, single location, single cloud, if you like. Make those things available, socialize via a developer portal, all that kind of good stuff. How do I generate that value for my end users? But very quickly, as things evolve, then you start to get into more complicated and more breadth of different scenarios. So very commonly, going from a single kind of isolated deployment to perhaps multiple different deployments. So a big journey for many of our customers, including Lloyds, is around how do we move from traditional on-premises deployment to various public cloud footprints as well. And in that case, it's very common to say, well, I've got some set of APIs I'll host from on-premise. Maybe I've got some different APIs that I want to host in my new public cloud area, perhaps driven by a digital enablement project or a new mobile application or a new kind of customer-facing footprint. So that drives these kind of disconnected pools of API delivery, as it were. And then this kind of middle one is looking at, well, the first of the kind of real hybrid scenarios. And in this case, it's saying, well, that there are cases where I want to deliver my API platform in a number of different pieces. So perhaps I have a central management control plane that's maybe hosted by a third party for me. But I want the runtime invocation piece, the gateway part of it, to live close to where my applications are still. So I can distribute that deployment in the way that says, well, all the kind of commodity piece that I don't have to worry too much about is managed for me by a third party, but still put that runtime piece close to the kind of real business logic. Then kind of going even further, kind of moving on from B through C and into D, is to say actually that there's a hybrid model that says, well, I might have both on-premise and public cloud environments, but actually I want to serve the same thing from those different deployment locations. So whether that's enabling more capacity for burst-style scenarios, or perhaps providing better high availability or disaster recovery type topologies. In this sort of model, I'm saying I want the same logical equivalent things in both places, but they are two independent deployments, so they're resilient from any failures that might occur between the two different sides. And then lastly, kind of dealing with the fact there's now more and more of these different things that have to be kind of dealt with, we get into a question of hybrid management. Like having deployed all of these many different pools of API capability, how do I manage them? How do I maintain them? How do I make it simple for all of my team to get a single view of the world, or to deal with all these things as if they're a single logical whole? So there's a range of these different hybrid cloud deployment style API models. But with them, as a technical person, with that comes a bunch of technical challenge that you and your teams will have to solve, certainly. So first of all, looking at things like platform portability. Like if I have footprint in my on-premise data center and in two different public clouds, say, how do I, what are the choices that I make in terms of how easy and how similar those different environments are? So one approach would be to say, well, I take an API platform, I can deploy it in my on-premise data center. I could also deploy that in a cloud. Maybe there's a managed SaaS version of that API platform that also runs in the cloud. So you could have a single logical product that exists in your various locations. Alternatively, you could say, well, I'll take the native API provider of those different cloud locations. Obviously, in that latter case, you've got different products and different technical constraints to work with. So there's a trade-off in terms of transferability versus the kind of direct in-cloud versus on-prem style deployment models. Flexibility of deployment as well. So how do I get that kind of scenario C style model that says, well, I can push my gateway into a remote location, but have the control plane managed by a third party for me? What are the various combinations that I can have of the topology components that make up the API management? And then looking at automation. So with any large-scale API program, a critically important piece becomes how do I automate this? How do I do CI/CD style kind of delivery pipelines? How do I make it simple and repeatable and generate high quality? Particularly if you're deploying across multiple different environments, different clouds and so forth, how do I make that kind of click button very straightforward for both my application developers and also for my kind of operations and SRE style teams? Runtime state replication as well. So the kind of further towards the right of the scenarios that I described that you go, the more requirement there is on how do I replicate not just configuration state, as in the set of APIs that I've got and where I've deployed them to, but things like the subscriptions and the applications that are registered, the end user consumer things that are more dynamic and kind of fast moving in terms of nature. So thinking in terms of how is it that I get those same API keys, those same credentials and security and registration information from my on-premise environment to my public cloud and back again in the case that I'm trying to provide that kind of federated hybrid, like an HADR scenario. Security, obviously, very important in any of our areas, but particularly in the banking sector as we're focusing on here. One of the key things in the context of hybrid cloud API management that's important from a security perspective are those links between the different pools of API space. So if I have public cloud and my on-prem, or two public clouds, like what are the lines between those environments? How do I secure that and make sure it's dealing with the right types of compliance and regulatory requirements? And then lastly, certainly by no means least, operational simplicity. So we all have teams of SRE folks. We have people inside of IBM that run our managed SaaS offerings, for example. How do we make their jobs easy and simple, dealing with the fact that they might have lots of different locations or perhaps disparate providers of APIs as well? So a range of different technical considerations that go with each of those API management style scenarios. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jeremy Mason, who's going to talk about the API journey at Lloyds. Jeremy.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
And thank you, Mehdi, for inviting me today. I'm Chief Architect for Digital Technologies at Lloyds Banking Group. So let's hope this works. Yeah, so before we get into it, a bit about Lloyds Banking Group. So Lloyds Banking Group is our corporate brand. It's an umbrella for a number of banks. We have a number of banking licenses. We also have an insurance and investments group as well. So our core sort of, if you like, our high street brands would be like you'd recognize Halifax, Lloyds Bank, Bank of Scotland. We also have a set of specialist brands as well, like Schroders Personal Wealth, MBNA, Black Horse, even Birmingham, Midshires for sort of buy-to-let loans, etc. So Embark Group's interesting because that's a savings and investments acquisition we did recently. I think when I reflect on the challenges at Lloyds Banking Group, it's probably two. So how do we embed a culture of being API first within the organisation? So as a set of technologists here in this, it kind of makes sense, but from a business perspective, as Simon was alluding to, it's a challenge, but I think we're getting there. I think, how do we execute that strategy with IBM, for example, in terms of our the infrastructure we need to land to support the scale and the breadth across the group. That is not a trivial thing for us with our size to do. We're not a monoline organisation. If we look at our business strategy, with Charlie Nunn joining the group as our CEO, I think the areas I wanted to highlight was increased digitisation, as you might expect. I think what's interesting as well is more personalisation around customers and deeper customer insights and more customer segmentation. Interestingly, we're talking about higher market share with intermediaries as well, which so whether that's motor finance, for example, integrating with JLR or Tesla dealerships, for example, or mortgages. It's definitely, or general insurance is definitely something we recognise, and I think that tends to be a good key in for the API strategy. Talking about maximising potential, I only really focused on if we're going to digitise, we're going to need to modernise. Therefore, there's a technology angle to that. So that's really exciting for us. And as a for example, we've got above the line in our messaging to the city about having 20% of our applications sitting on cloud, which is an awesome outcome by 2024. Our API strategy, so we've kind of got a business lens on this and a technology lens on this. So from a business perspective, we think about the what. So we talk about API quality. So we want a well-merchandised marketplace where all the APIs across the group, right from commercial banking through to motor finance, through to mortgages, they all need to look and feel the same. How we operate those APIs, so things like the standard headers, the error blocks, etc., they all need to be consistent. The documentation needs to be consistent. The levels of support as well. And being able to discover those APIs, whether you're a CIO, external, a fintech, a developer, we should make that, or even an internal developer, we need to make that experience easy. Why? And this is really important from a business perspective. So we need to retain business. Our commercial customers want integrated supply chains, so that's really key that we deliver those APIs. We think about asset finance, invoice finance, trade finance, all delivered through APIs. We've got new revenue opportunities, new propositions, digital ID, for example. So those are really exciting for us. And we talk about open banking with Mark as well. So, but what's next beyond open banking, which is like your core banking, accounts, payments. So we talk about pensions dashboard, for example. So we want to respond to the market needs. And if we can build those APIs, it's going to put us in a better position. What I would say is I think we are making headway with the business. There is a board metric to increase the number of strategic APIs by 25% year on year over 3 years. And I'm pleased to say we've already hit that target this year. So, and I think that just begins to show that the API thinking is getting embedded into the bank. From a technology perspective, API management is at the heart of what we do. So we have a set of systems of record, like our core banking systems, our customer systems, our payment systems. We interface to those systems through API management, predominantly IBM API Connect. We do over 1 billion API calls per month, and we have 250 plus unique APIs on our platforms right now. So on the bottom left, there's a little bit insight into our technology. So we've got like Kafka, we've got Cassandra, for example, as a system of engagement. We're able to improve the performance of our open banking APIs by 20% by introducing Cassandra as an edge cache for our core banking system. And that also reduce the number of errors in the APIs as well. But internal versus external, what does that mean? So we think about delivering journeys for colleagues and customers. Well, if you walk into a branch and you want to make a payment, it's the same journey fundamentally as we deliver digitally through for our customers through our mobile app, for example, and our browser experience. So we expect to see the same APIs supporting those journeys. And there's a huge opportunity for reuse there and cost savings. Externally, with open banking, for example, we've got balance inquiry, we've got make payment inquiries. What's the difference? Well, fundamentally they're the same. So we've got the same fundamental APIs behind the scenes, but we know that the experience is different. So with open banking, I mean, it's one of the highlights of my career to work on that program, working with the OpenID Foundation, for example, and getting to work with John Bradley, for example, and that team. The UK was leading, really, in the implementation of that security profile, which was a build on top of OpenID Connect, the financial API profile. And it's just really great to see that we're on the leading edge there. But that's a different security profile to what we would use, say, within our mobile apps. So it's just something to be aware of. So one of the challenges we have is the scale of our organization. We've got 5+ business divisions. We've got multiple engineering labs, all with their own ideas and their own experiences working in those labs. So driving that consistency is a challenge. But we don't want to lock up change in the organization by being overly heavy-handed on control. Hopefully that makes sense. So we want to devolve and federate. So we have multiple gateway deployments to support both agility, but also to support operational resilience. If we had one single API management cluster stretched across multiple clouds, that would be an operational resilience challenge for us. Think about the upgrades, for example. So we have lots of deployments of API management platforms. API Connect, for example, has multiple form factors. We deploy it on virtual servers. We deploy it on physical data powers. We're also looking at OpenShift as well and deploying that on x86, but also on Z mainframe as well. So it gives us some sort of flexibility around that. But what you get then is a lot of developer portals. And you've got open banking developers logging in to their developer portal via open banking directory. You've got internal developers logging in via Microsoft Active Directory. And what about third-party developers who are not part of the open banking scheme? So we need to create a new identity for those users as well. So there's a few things to think about, and how do we bring it all together? So what we've done, we've got this kind of concept of an API marketplace, which we layer on top of our production instances of our gateways. That pulls all the API specifications together and publishes them out. Our first internal marketplace is going live this year. We're hoping to get our external marketplace going live next year. But also self-service as well, so the ability to subscribe to APIs through that marketplace as well. And the vendors offer really well-formed APIs that allow us to pull the API specs out, but also to subscribe developers to API products. So that works really well. And this is an example of what that looks like. So this is coming to life now, but you would expect to see in there the ability to search for APIs through a number of indexes, for example, whether that's business divisions like consumer finance, consumer servicing, business and commercial banking, just examples of how you might find those APIs, but also by using our domain models as well, so fraud APIs or payments APIs. There's multiple ways we can get to the APIs. Click through as you would expect to see, to look at the open API specs, see samples, etc. The sort of things you see with the standard out-of-the-box dev portals you get from the vendor offerings. So it's going to bring it all together. And I think what I also notice and observe is if an engineer writes a description for an API, it's not the sort of description you would expect or you want to see on a public-facing API marketplace. So there's definitely an element of curation where we need to get product ownership around and sponsorship of our APIs and the curation of the more accessible content that we'd want to publish out onto, for example, on the internet. Just one more slide from me. So we talked about API quality. So we have sets of standards around how developers build open API specs, and also specific standards on the vendors as well, and how we use those vendor products. So, and we have common sets of policies and common sets of security profiles. Well, how do we manage the enforcement now across such a large organization? So we have a tool which we call Flash that automates the validation of the open API standards before they get deployed onto our gateways. So really good adoption, not 100% adoption. So occasionally we deploy APIs to production if we're under business pressure that don't fully comply with our API standards. But broadly speaking, we see how we're trying to raise the bar. But the value metrics, so we've had some really good reduction in error demand by using automation. So we've reduced the validation of API standards from a manual process that took 5 days to just taking 1 day. And we've also used Flash to automate the deployment of the policies onto some of our API management technologies as well. And that's had a major reduction from days to 10 minutes. But hopefully that gives you an insight into some of the challenges that we face as a large group and operating an API management strategy across a number of divisions with a large number of engineering labs, and how we're using technologies like an API marketplace and automated governance to drive consistency across our group. Matt, I'll hand back over to you.
Yep. Good. Great. Thank you very much, Jeremy. Just to wrap up, kind of three key points here. So hybrid cloud API management is increasingly common in scenarios like Jeremy was describing for Lloyds, due to the breadth and kind of scope of different API scenarios. There are a range of different patterns, the kind of pictures that I was talking through, and the use cases that would drive those adoptions. But even in regulated industries, financial services that we're discussing over the next couple of days, and other industries, retail and government and so forth, those patterns can provide that flexibility and agility to drive success for the business. So I know we're short on time, but thank you very much. We'll certainly be at the IBM booth upstairs in the Partner Village during the rest of the day if you'd like to drop by and ask any questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. We have time for one question if someone wants to ask something about the implementation, the strategy, the sponsorship, whatever. We good? Yes. Every time I say we're good, we finally have the question.
Thank you. Hi, so the API marketplace stuff, I thought all looks really interesting. Is it fair to say that you're looking to take on more of that like black bar role with businesses outside of the bank, as in the previous presentations? Are you looking to become an embedded finance provider more so for other businesses?
Yeah, 100%. So I think intermediaries and growing the intermediary market for us is part of our strategy. It's just part of our business model. So we do have a super app in our Lloyds app that has 17 million active users, but we also recognize that B2B relationship is equally as important, and we're responding to the market needs, whether that's motor finance or mortgages or commercial banking. So even payables APIs is something that we currently support.